I want to talk about the Moxy. When did you first encounter the Moxy monitor?
Yeah, so I first encountered it when Roger was presenting the early version at the Design a Medical Device conference, which was here at the University of Minnesota. At the time, I was actually working part-time for a medical device company in cardiovascular products. And so I went to it, and he happened to be there, and I was like, well, this looks interesting. So I kind of talked to him about it, and I was like, wow, that's a pretty cool idea. And just kind of kept following it for a while. And I've told him this too, so it's not like a secret. So it wasn't like early on that I didn't trust the device. It was more the interfaces were just so kludgy, And so I was like, God, I don't know if I want to spend the money to do it or not. So I was one of these people who just kept waiting and waiting because I saw how everything was progressing. And so a couple of years ago, I ended up buying like the system and just been kind of playing around with it since.
What do you think of it initially in terms of its application? Besides let's say the logistics of getting the data itself, what do you think of it initially?
Well, what I always wanted, and which they have now, is devices that can look local and also systemic, right? So I think Moxy is like really good for a local look. Right. So something you can slap on a muscle, you can get some basic information from that particular muscle. I think that's super cool. That's awesome. The downside is because it's local, you're only getting local data, right? Which has its pros and has its cons. That's just the nature of the beast. So if you have a couple more devices, if you have 3, right, you can put one on like what's common, one on the right quad, one on the left quad, maybe one on a shoulder if they're doing a row or something like that. Kind of a more non-working muscle view too. And now what they have, I know you had Daniel on here too, with the PNOV device, you can get a metabolic cart at the systemic level. So a lot of my research was using, like hundreds of different metabolic carts for testing. And so I was more used to the systemic view. And, when I bought the PNOV device, I talked to them early on about integration with Moxy, and they said, yeah, it's on the list. We're going to do it. And so I think being able to get all of those things at once is kind of the future. And I think the interfaces are definitely getting a lot better. I know Moxy has an app they're doing a Kickstarter for now and stuff. And, Moxy was able early on to integrate into the Garmin, like the Garmin Phoenix, which I think is probably an underutilized thing for training with it, not just testing. But to answer your question, I think being able to see local data and then being able to pair that with systemic data, and if you can get it synced where it's all in the same time course, to me that's like super useful, right? Because now I can get heart rate, I can get some local data, and I can get systemic data. And that kind of gets you around some of the potential issues people could get themselves into if they don't look at the whole picture, right? So people send data, it's like, okay, that's cool. But like, what was the guy's output if you're doing it on a rower? Like the rower tells you watts. It tells you you like output, because at the end of the day, the athlete cares about the output. So if you don't have any fancy testing and your output is getting better and better and your heart rate's staying around the same, you've made a physiologic improvement, and it's probably an efficiency improvement. So again, I think just being able to look at the whole picture of everything is super useful. And as that gets easier and easier to do, I think it'll be more accessible to more people too.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And one thing that I found using it about 6 months ago is that as I've used it more, I understand a lot more of it. Now I try to actually use it every single day, whether it's with me or with clients or athletes, because I find that you just need a lot of practice. So for yourself, what have you learned since you started using the device, and what have you changed in your process with your learned experience?
Yeah, I mean, probably and it sounds simple, but the biggest thing I learned was, so when we had the coronavirus and the lockdown started last March, I've converted my garage into a gym and testing center like 12 years ago. So it was great. I'm like, oh, well, maybe this is a perfect time to do more aerobic block, do a little bit more testing, set up my bike from high school, which is like a 25-year-old bike with road tires on it. Just put a little trainer on it and stuck a cheap sensor for speed on it. And I wanted to get power, but I didn't want to drop that much money. The sensors would have cost more on the damn bike, so I didn't do it. But I'm like, I got speed, I got some, distance. I got the basic parameters. And I've got a Concept 2 rower, a bunch of other equipment. So I'm like, I don't know, I'm just gonna, because for quite a while, for probably like 1 or 2 years, I just stopped following everyone online with what they were doing. And it wasn't that they were doing anything bad or even incorrect. I couldn't figure out heads or tails. And because everyone had kind of done it so much, they had kind of developed their own protocols and stuff, which is great. Mm-hmm. So I'm just like, screw this. I'm just gonna go back to like, what's the first principle, right? Like, what does the thing look at? Like, how accurate is it? What is it telling me? So the biggest thing I figured out was when I started doing aerobic stuff, I'm like, okay, I'm going to do your classic, zone 2, zone 3-ish, long, slow aerobic distance stuff in the morning. So did that fasted, did some cold water immersion afterwards. And it went pretty good for like 3 weeks. And I started doing my normal training on top of it. And then started around week 2.5 even, my legs were just freaking sore like every day. And I'm like, I'm probably just not used to the work, whatever. And then I'm like, I got like how many thousands of dollars worth of equipment, like maybe I should test some shit, And so I just threw the Moxy on there. And what I realized was that even at about the same heart rate, again, for my physiology, on the Moxy, when I put it on the quad, like I was hitting a DSAT of in the 20s within probably a minute on the rower. I wasn't going that hard. Like, at best, my heart rate would only hit like, upper 130s, low 140s, nasal breathing, relatively easy-ish. I would go on the bike and I would try to match the same heart rate again. And my DSATs are just hanging out at like in the 40s. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. And it's like for people listening, I view the rower for leg stuff then, again, local data, that's actually much closer to weight training. Right, where you're stripping all the oxygen off like really, really fast, and my DSATs would stay down there, and I'm like, oh shit. So like rowing, even though my heart rate was about the same, like even RPE was around the same, but for that particular muscle group, at least for the legs or the quads, they're actually doing a lot more quote unquote work than if I did something like that on the bike. So when I switched to doing more stuff on the bike, cut down on the distance on the rower, then all of a sudden my legs recovered. I'm like, it seems like kind of obvious, but I've been more kind of classically trained that, if your heart rate is the same, your RPE is around the same, it's got to be the same amount of work. But yet I knew that it could be different for different muscle groups. But I think having the actual data and looking at it, and I did this on multiple different days too. So it wasn't the same each day, but the trend was usually about a 20 difference between the two.
Yeah, which is pretty huge. And that's one thing I got from listening to a lot of Daniel's work. For example, for triathletes, you'll want to test them separately on the bike and on the run, because like you said, the work is different, right? The speed of contraction, the range of motion, all those things, your position as well, right? Whether you're standing up, sitting forward on a bike, sitting on the rower, all these things influence how your body is going to accommodate and do the work. Hence the need or the utility of having that inside look at what's going on at the muscle site.
Yeah, and people can do this too, like even if they just look at heart rate. So when I'm on the bike, and again, this could be related to the position of the heart rate strap, but I've tried different strap versions. If I bend over more, my heart rate will actually change. If I sit up more, it actually gets a little bit better. And people are like, so if I'm not measuring output and I'm just thinking about training, that may be okay for training depending on what I'm wanting to do. The caveat is, again, you would have to measure that in a real life circumstance and measure output at the same time to see if that's even useful, right? Because I could extrapolate that data and say, you crazy cyclists, you need to, ride more upright. Everyone listening is going, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard of in my life, right? Because now you have massive wind resistance. Yeah. But if you look at your performance on the bike, you would see your performance would drop then at that point, right? So I think sometimes we get carried away, myself included, using kind of surrogate markers of what's going on and then forgetting to measure the thing in a different circumstance. And again, still measuring output too, to see what's going on.
And I think that's where maybe Daniel's kind of testing approach comes in, where you will test with the Moxy and the heart rate. Then for that next training block, you can use heart rate as a proxy for your Moxy zones, right? So you can see
Yes.
when the SMO2 trend is going up, that's your zone 1. So you know your heart rate is between or under a certain value. Then you get your zone 2 when your SMO2 is flat. And then you got zone 3, zone 4 with different levels of, or different rates of desaturation. But it works for a while. And then you have to retest, because if your training is done properly, your zones are going to change, right? Which is really interesting.
Yeah. And the other way to get around that too is if you have like a Phoenix or something and it's running's a little bit easier to check your watch than it is rowing. You know, you can still do it. It's just a little different. Just throw a sensor on a few days and maybe train only to that specific amount. Right. So what I've been trying to do on the rower now is I'm like, okay, so if I'm one of those people where for whatever reason, my SMO2 just plummets right away, I've been playing around with just mentally doing different things based on the feedback, right? To see, can I hold the same output, like a low output, like 200 watts, and can I actually get my DSAT paradoxically to go up? Can I get from the 20s to the 30s, right? And so in my head, I'm thinking, if I can do that and I can hold the same output, I'm more efficient, right? So I'm getting a better relaxation when I have the rest phase of rowing, right? I'm just using general terms, that I can get more blood flow. I can change that DSAT. So that's something it seems very obvious now, but I didn't think of before, because my assumptions were, oh yeah, if you're training, you just want to hammer it as low as possible. Yeah. And there's days to do that. But if your goal at the end is to increase, say, a 5K or a 2K, you want to be as efficient as possible on each stroke. So I think training efficiency at a separate session, training more physical capacity on a separate session is probably a good way of trying to do it. And then hopefully they'll kind of, merge up at the end.
Yeah. Another big thing that came out for me using the Moxy more and more is how low of an output I need to be at, even on a bike erg, to see an upwards trend on that SMO2 line. And it's ridiculously slow. And so I guess the conclusion of that is everybody's probably riding just way too fast when they think they're going slow. They're actually not going that slow.
Yeah, and I was surprised too on the bike. Like I said, I was, unfortunately this past year has been kind of a shit show in terms of trying to test other people and get more data. But so at least on myself and just a handful of people, I was surprised that, yeah, to your point, how low and slow I actually had to go to see it kind of go up. And then the other part too was in the past, I was not a big fan of warm-ups per se. It's like, yeah, I read all the research on it. I get it. Yeah. Just, warm up, don't hurt yourself, you'll be fine. But to see, like, if I put the Moxy on cold, if I'm going to do like front squats, at best when I'm resting, I'm hitting like upper 60s, maybe low 70s. And then when I'm warmed up and everything is good, I'm hitting like the low 80s. And this is before doing any work. I'm like, oh shit, so it probably does matter more than I thought.
Yeah. If nothing else, you want your quote unquote battery to be as big and as full as possible before you start your session. If you don't, you're actually missing out on something there, and you should extend your warm up. That's something I've been trying to play with and adjust and figure out, okay, what do I actually need to get my SMO2 to 80 on the bike? So right now what I've found is if I do 4 or 5 minutes of easy riding and then ramp up progressively over 4 minutes, so I get to between 8 and 10, and then I do a couple bouts of 45 seconds hard. The first one pretty hard, the second one a little harder, and then I wait for 2 or 3 minutes, then I'm in the 80s, and then I'm good to start my session. But yeah, you actually have to start slower than you think, and you have to finish your warm-up stronger than you would have thought to actually get yourself ready for the work you're about to do.
Yeah, and I think that's really good to know depending on what you're doing, right? So if I'm going to do like a max 2K, then on the days I'm doing an actual test, then my warm-up is substantially longer. If I'm just doing low to moderate intensity stuff, I will just get on the thing cold in the morning and just start going, right? Exactly. Because I'm not as concerned about that all-out absolute performance. It's a low enough thing. I'm not going to hurt myself, that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think that makes a huge difference. But it gives you a way to quantify it and to know that, okay, this is a test day, or this is a day I need to be at a higher percentage output. It's going to take me about 5 minutes to warm up. Okay, cool. That's, totally worth the time investment on it.
Mhm. Is there any other maybe details that you've garnered from looking at your data over the past few weeks, to maybe insights that you maybe hadn't noticed before, or nuances that came up?
Um, those are probably the main ones. I've been playing around with now trying to put another sensor on the other leg and look at differences.
Mhm.
I think it's highly subjective to location. So my buddy Ben House and I were joking about this the other day. Like even maybe for some biometric markers, maybe we need like just a permanent tattoo on your leg or something, so like you get like the same location all the time. That's probably not the world's best idea. But I think location and all that stuff makes a big difference because of some of the assumptions that go into it.
Mm.
But again, you're looking at data relatively to yourself, and if you've done enough testing, you kind of have an idea of where you're at. I am kind of surprised, and again, I would like to get more data on this and talk to others who have a lot more data. I just wonder about the testing of limiters. How much does that change on a day-by-day basis? Right? So if we brought someone in like just like 3-4 days in a row and we do 515 or whatever testing, just pick your thing, like would we get a different analysis from that each day? Right? Because what I've seen some days, just on myself and a handful of other people, is that some days like I can hit low 80% when I start and everything is great. Other days, like I do the same warm up, I do whatever, and like the best I get is like the upper 70s. So it's like, is my body using a different strategy on those different days? Like, so one day would I show up maybe having a true respiratory limitation, whatever that is, or that's a whole podcast in and of itself. Would I have a muscle limit maybe on another day, which again, that even discrepancy is debatable. Because my gut feeling is that there's more variability there than what we think. And that doesn't mean that a lot of that testing is worthless at all. If someone has a major limitation, it'll probably show up each time. But again, I just wonder if the body is sort of clamped to that output and you have a high level athlete who can hit that output on most days, day in and day out, my guess is that they may be using different strategies a little bit on each day in order to accomplish that. And then you get into the whole mess of, well, maybe that was fatigue because the first day they really had a true respiratory limitation and you just hammered them on that. And so now that's going to be a little bit more behind because it's more fatigue than a different system. And so now you're actually not testing the same thing you were testing before, even though you're trying to. And yeah, it just makes your head spin.
But I think it is interesting with those new technologies to try and play devil's advocate. While you were saying this, I was just thinking even temperature from one day to the next,
Yeah.
and the impact on heart rate alone, and then the heart rate trend that we're going to be looking at, and whether it plateaus at the top or not for a quote unquote cardiovascular limitation, that might be affected as well by just, the room you're in, or whether you're in the sun or in the shade or inside or outside.
Yeah, and even just, different heart rate variability status each day. What's the status of your autonomic nervous system? If you're more stressed acutely, but your chronic HRV is okay, meaning you could probably drop the hammer and, get a good output that day. But are you using a slightly different strategy because you have a little bit more stress on board for whatever reason? I don't know the answer to that, but I think that the future is taking some type of gauge, like putting a Moxy on and having an app or something to use to do more biofeedback type training, I think is kind of the future, right? So you could have days, and other guys have talked about this too, that I'm just going to hammer my SO2 as low as I can, right? I'm going to do intervals. Aaron Davis has talked about this. Just hammer it as low as possible. I'm going to wait till it recovers, then I'm going to go again, right? And I'm going to hammer it again, and once it stops recovering within a certain amount of time, then I'm done. Right, like Cal Dietz has talked about the same thing, using heart rate biometric method for training, right, or using velocity-based training. It's all the same idea. It's like, what quality are you taking? And now we have the ability to monitor that thing live. I think to me that's going to be almost maybe even more useful than some of the testing, because if your testing is a little bit different, it doesn't matter because you're watching that live thing all the time and you're training based on that. Again, assuming we have the right variable we're watching.
Yeah, and to your point on this, I remember Evan mentioning something that he did when he was training on the rower a lot. For 6 months straight, he did this exact same repeat desaturation, so kind of sprint intervals on, I think it was every Tuesday for 6 months. And he said from 1 week to the next, he was able to do sometimes 5 intervals before hitting his kind of failure criteria, sometimes 15, and then 3, and then 30, and there was no rhyme or reason, and he tried to figure it out. But again, to your point, there's a huge variability there. And like you said, maybe utilizing a tool like this, the testing aspect is super interesting, but I'm on your side when it comes to using it on a day-to-day basis as an auto-regulation tool and a monitoring tool. And that, I think that's really where it comes in full force, more than even just the testing side.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, you're looking at kind of so how I think of it is, okay, I can get performance live. Great. Can I get a cost metric with that? Kind of RPE, heart rate. But if I go one step under the hood, could I look at breathing changes, right? If I want to put on a full, metabolic heart, RER changes, all the other metrics you get from that, local changes. Yeah, because everyone who's trained long enough knows this happens, right? Like you have some days you're like, your rest of your life is pretty good. Your training just sucked and you have no idea why. You can't figure it out. And then you're kind of disappointed. This happened to me when I was traveling and came back. And then like the week after I did the same thing again, I got like a lifetime PR, and it's like and there wasn't that much variability in my life. HRV was a little different, but not massively different, so I just think there's a lot more, Devin's point too, there's a lot more variability in the underlying system than we understand. And you can either spend all your time trying to understand it and test it and do predictions of performance, which historically has been pretty shitty. Or you can just say, screw it. I'm just going to pick a couple things I'm going to look at each day, heart rate variability, sleep, whatever. And then I'm just going to go train whatever the highest quality capacity I could get at that point. And I don't need to know what that is because I will find it. Right. It's like what Evan was saying. Okay. Yeah, I hit my threshold. I only got 3 sets in. Okay, great. Oh, now I hit my threshold. I got 15. And so I remember talking to Cal Dietz years ago at the U of M, and he's like 45 minutes. He's drawn out this entire whiteboard, and I was supposed to help him with an article about it. And at the end, I'm looking at him, and I'm thinking, how the hell am I going to translate this into an article? We should have done a video. And so I looked at him. I'm like, okay, so what you're saying is all this is based on do the highest quality work first, and then repeat that as much as you can. And he kind of stares at me, and he's like, yes. And it's like, if most people just did that, they would be pretty good. They would be pretty good.
Yeah. No, I'm definitely with you on that. Do you think that Moxy as a technology, as a wearable tool, is going to kind of morph over the next few years, maybe decade, in the new kind of heart rate sensor? Is it going to be democratized a lot more, in your opinion, or is it going to remain something pretty maybe specific or specialized?
I don't know. I mean, my prediction, and I'm not the best at predictions, right? I'm pretty horrible at them. But like after I saw it, my prediction was like, oh my God, within like 2 or 3 years, like everyone's going to be doing this, and it'll go to your watch and it'll go to an app and everyone will be, and it's like, nah, nobody cared. It's like, oh, okay. A few people did, then I'm like, well, maybe it's the interface. And then at the end of the day, I think you're left with the technology has to get so simple that people can do it without understanding it, which again presents a whole host of other problems associated with it, because now you've got an over application of something people don't understand, right? So look at heart rate variability, right? Initially, at least in the modern literature, 1968, the cosmonauts used it, I think. And then now it's almost showing up everywhere because the technology, you can get it off of the wrist, and it may or may not be accurate. That's a whole separate debate. But it's at the point where people get a number and they have no idea how they got it. But manufacturers will put it in everything now because, it's the marker of stress, right? So we've passed the point where it wasn't really used because people didn't understand it. A few hardcore people did. Then it was kind of at this sweet spot where only the people who kind of understand it were using it. And now it's kind of gone almost so far where everyone's abusing it for everything else. All right. My guess is that Moxy and other technologies will probably follow the similar path.
Yeah.
Right.
That's probably a big problem, considering the number of interpretations that you can have of the data itself. I mean, recently I did a test with a client, then we did a follow-up training session with the Moxy as well. And I kind of wrote out what I analyzed, what I saw, or what I thought I saw, and then sent it to 2 different people who have literally been doing this for, years and years. And I got 2 completely different interpretations of the data that I had collected. So if still today, it's hard for the best of the best to, have a consensus or think in the same way. It just shows how complicated it is on an underlying level, and how, like you said, maybe having it go to everybody and use it in a very simplistic way might not be the best way to leverage that technology.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to and they have a fair amount of research on Moxy, but there's not as much on the application to drive training, right? And I could say that about any device too. I'm not just picking on them. That's common across the industry, right? So if we agree on an assessment, okay, so let's say we train and we hammer our DSAT every day and we do like an auto-regulated thing versus a standard protocol. Does the auto-regulated show up to actually be better in terms of an outcome? Mm-hmm. I would say probably yes, but I can't point to any hard data that says that, mm-hmm. right? Even using heart rate variability, which has been around even longer in terms of auto-regulated training via HRV, is it better or not? I would say in general, most of the data says that it's better, but if you read the abstracts, you'd probably disagree with that. Because again, what is your definition of better? To me, if I got the same output and got it, like one study showed, 2 weeks earlier, cool, that's a win, right? That's a whole nother 2 weeks I'd have to train that particular athlete. Mm-hmm. Someone else could read it and say, well, it doesn't matter. At the end of the study, they both got to the same result. Mm-hmm. So again, a lot of it goes back to interpretation, and it's like genetics. Like people are like, oh, I want to do this genetic test, and it says that Bob here wants to be an Olympic bobsled pusher. He's got slow twitch fibers mostly. Oh, poor Bob. Like maybe for screening, maybe, ethics aside. But what if Bob does really want to train for that? And his whole goal is to be an Olympic level athlete to the highest caliber he can. Maybe he doesn't have the best genetics, but what does that mean? Does that mean I'm going to have him do like 1x20 and not have him train speed and power? His sport is speed and power. So I don't know how that changes the variable of training. And that's the hard part, is because we don't have any data to suggest which way to go. And that's kind of where we're at right now. I think it's better. I think it's definitely going to be useful, but what exact protocol does that look like, right? And everyone's kind of has their own favorites that they do, and a lot of it works, really well. There's just nothing else to compare it to.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess time will tell in that regard.